Vicissitudes of Flight. Chapter 3. The Vicissitudes of Flight. This is what had taken place that same night at the La Force. An escape had been planned between Babet, Brujon, Guelemer, and Thénardier, although Thénardier was in close confinement. Babet had arranged the matter for his own benefit, on the same day, as the reader has seen from Montparnasse's account to Gavroche. Montparnasse was to help them from outside. Brujon, after having passed a month in the punishment cell, had had time, in the first place, to weave a rope, in the second, to mature a plan. In former times, those severe places where the discipline of the prison delivers the convict into his own hands, were composed of 4 stone walls, a stone ceiling, a flagged pavement, a camp bed, a grated window, and a door lined with iron, and were called dungeons. But the dungeon was judged to be too terrible. Nowadays they are composed of an iron door, a grated window, a camp bed, a flagged pavement, 4 stone walls, and a stone ceiling, and are called chambers of punishment. A little light penetrates towards midday. The inconvenient point about these chambers, which, as the reader sees, are not dungeons, is that they allow the persons who should be at work to think. So Brujon meditated, and he emerged from the chamber of punishment with a rope. As he had the name of being very dangerous in the Charlemagne courtyard, he was placed in the new building. The first thing he found in the new building was guelemer, the second was a nail. Guelemer, that is to say, crime. A nail, that is to say, liberty. Brujon, of whom it is high time that the reader should have a complete idea, was, with an appearance of delicate health and a profoundly premeditated languor, a polished, intelligent sprig, and a thief, who had a caressing glance, and an atrocious smile. His glance resulted from his will, and his smile from his nature. His first studies in his art had been directed to roofs. He had made great progress in the industry of the men who tear off lead, who plunder the roofs and despoil the gutters by the process called double pickings. The circumstance which put the finishing touch on the moment peculiarly favorable for an attempt at escape was that the roofers were relaying and rejointing, at that very moment, a portion of the slates on the prison. The St. Bernard courtyard was no longer absolutely isolated from the Charlemagne and the St. Louis courts. Up above there were scaffoldings and ladders. In other words, bridges and stairs in the direction of liberty. The new building, which was the most cracked and decrepit thing to be seen anywhere in the world, was the weak point in the prison. The walls were eaten by saltpetre to such an extent that the authorities had been obliged to line the vaults of the dormitories with a sheathing of wood. Because stones were in the habit of becoming detached and falling on the prisoners in their beds. In spite of this antiquity, the authorities committed the error of confining in the new building the most troublesome prisoners, of placing there the hard cases, as they say in prison parlance. The new building contained 4 dormitories, one above the other, and a top story which was called the Bel Air. Fine air. A large chimney flue, probably from some ancient kitchen of the Ducs de la Force, started from the ground floor, traversed all 4 stories, cut the dormitories, where it figured as a flattened pillar, into 2 portions, and finally pierced the roof. Guelemer and Brujon were in the same dormitory. They had been placed, by way of precaution, on the lower story. Chance ordained that the heads of their beds should rest against the chimney. Thénardier was directly over their heads in the top story known as fine air. The pedestrian who halts on the Rue Culture Saint Catherine, after passing the barracks of the firemen, in front of the porte cochere of the bathing establishment, beholds a yard full of flowers and shrubs in wooden boxes, at the extremity of which spreads out a little white rotunda with 2 wings, brightened up with green shutters, the bucolic dream of Jean-Jacques. Not more than 10 years ago, there rose above that rotunda an enormous black, hideous, bare wall by which it was backed up. This was the outer wall of La Force. This wall, beside that rotunda, was Milton viewed through Birkin. Lofty as it was, This wall was overtopped by a still blacker roof, which could be seen beyond. This was the roof of the new building. There one could descry 4 dormer windows, guarded with bars. They were the windows of the fine air. A chimney pierced the roof. This was the chimney which traversed the dormitories. The Bel Air, that top story of the new building, was a sort of large hall, with a mansard roof, guarded with triple gratings and double doors of sheet iron, which were studded with enormous bolts. When one entered from the north end, one had on one's left the 4 dormer windows. On one's right, facing the windows, at regular intervals, 4 square, tolerably vast cages, separated by narrow passages, built of masonry to about the height of the elbow, and the rest, up to the roof, of iron bars. Thénardier had been in solitary confinement in one of these cages since the night of the 3d of February. No one was ever able to discover how, and by what connivance, he succeeded in procuring and secreting a bottle of wine, invented, so it is said, by Despoil, with which a narcotic is mixed, and which the band of the endormeurs, or sleep compellers, rendered famous. There are, in many prisons, treacherous employees, half jailers, half thieves, who assist in escapes, who sell to the police an unfaithful service, and who turn a penny whenever they can. On that same night, then, when little Gavroche picked up the 2 lost children, Brujon and Guelemer, who knew that Babette, who had escaped that morning, was waiting for them in the street as well as Montparnasse, rose softly, and with the nail which Brujon had found, began to pierce the chimney against which their bed stood. The rubbish fell on Brujon's bed, so that they were not heard. Showers mingled with thunder shook the doors on their hinges, and created in the prison a terrible and opportune uproar. Those of the prisoners who woke, pretended to fall asleep again, and left Guelemer and Brujon to their own devices. Brujon was adroit. Guelemer was vigorous. Before any sound had reached the watcher, who was sleeping in the grated cell which opened into the dormitory, the wall had been pierced, the chimney scaled, the iron grating which barred the upper orifice of the flue forced, and the 2 redoubtable ruffians were on the roof. The wind and rain redoubled, the roof was slippery. "What a good night to leg it," said Brujon. An abyss 6 feet broad and 80 feet deep separated them from the surrounding wall. At the bottom of this abyss, they could see the musket of a sentinel gleaming through the gloom. They fastened one end of the rope which Brujon had spun in his dungeon to the stumps of the iron bars which they had just wrenched off, flung the other over the outer wall, crossed the abyss at one bound, clung to the coping of the wall, got astride of it, let themselves slip, one after the other, along the rope, upon a little roof which touches the bath-house, pulled their rope after them, jumped down into the courtyard of the bath-house, traversed it, pushed open the porter's wicket, beside which hung his rope, pulled this, opened the porte-cochere, and found themselves in the street. 3/4 of an hour had not elapsed since they had risen in bed in the dark, nail in hand, and their project in their heads. A few moments later they had joined Babette and Montparnasse, who were prowling about the neighborhood. They had broken their rope in pulling it after them, and a bit of it remained attached to the chimney on the roof. They had sustained no other damage, however, than that of scratching nearly all the skin off their hands. That night, Thénardier was warned, without any one being able to explain how, and was not asleep. Towards 1 o'clock in the morning, the night being very dark, he saw 2 shadows pass along the roof, in the rain and squalls, in front of the dormer window which was opposite his cage. One halted at the window, long enough to dart in a glance. This was Brujon. Thénardier recognized him, and understood. This was enough. Thénardier, rated as a burglar, and detained as a measure of precaution under the charge of organizing a nocturnal ambush, with armed force, was kept in sight. The sentry, who was relieved every 2 hours, marched up and down in front of his cage with loaded musket. The fine air was lighted by a skylight. The prisoner had on his feet fetters weighing 50 pounds. Every day, at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, a jailer, escorted by 2 dogs, this was still in vogue at that time, entered his cage, deposited beside his bed a loaf of black bread weighing 2 pounds, a jug of water, a bowl filled with rather thin bouillon, in which swam a few Mayagan beans, inspected his irons and tapped the bars. This man and his dogs made 2 visits during the night. Thénardier had obtained permission to keep a sort of iron bolt which he used to spike his bread into a crack in the wall, in order to preserve it from the rats, as he said. As Thénardier was kept in sight, no objection had been made to this spike. Still, it was remembered afterwards, that one of the jailers had said, it would be better to let him have only a wooden spike. At 2 o'clock in the morning, the sentinel, who was an old soldier, was relieved, and replaced by a conscript. A few moments later, the man with the dogs paid his visit, and went off without noticing anything, except, possibly, the excessive youth and the rustic air of the raw recruit. 2 hours afterwards, at 4 o'clock, when they came to relieve the conscript, he was found asleep on the floor, lying like a log near Thénardier's cage. As for Thénardier, he was no longer there. There was a hole in the ceiling of his cage, and, above it, another hole in the roof. One of the planks of his bed had been wrenched off, and probably carried away with him, as it was not found. They also seized in his cell a half-empty bottle which contained the remains of the stupefying wine with which the soldier had been drugged. The soldier's bayonet had disappeared. At the moment when this discovery was made, it was assumed that Thénardier was out of reach. The truth is, that he was no longer in the new building, but that he was still in great danger. Thénardier, on reaching the roof of the new building, had found the remains of Brujon's rope hanging to the bars of the upper trap of the chimney. But, as this broken fragment was much too short, he had not been able to escape by the outer wall, as Brujon and Guelemer had done. When one turns from the Rue de Balais into the Rue du Aroidesicile, one almost immediately encounters a repulsive ruin. There stood on that spot, in the last century, a house of which only the back wall now remains, a regular wall of masonry, which rises to the height of the 3rd story between the adjoining buildings. This ruin can be recognized by 2 large square windows which are still to be seen there. The middle one, that nearest the right gable, is barred with a worm-eaten beam adjusted like a prop. Through these windows there was formerly visible a lofty and lugubrious wall, which was a fragment of the outer wall of La Force. The empty space on the street left by the demolished house is half filled by a fence of rotten boards, shored up by 5 stone posts. In this recess lies concealed a little shanty which leans against the portion of the ruin which has remained standing. The fence has a gate, which, a few years ago, was fastened only by a latch. It was the crest of this ruin that Thénardier had succeeded in reaching, a little after 1 o'clock in the morning. How had he got there? That is what no one has ever been able to explain or understand. The lightning must, at the same time, have hindered and helped him. Had he made use of the ladders and scaffoldings of the slaters to get from roof to roof, from enclosure to enclosure, from compartment to compartment, to the buildings of the Charlemagne court, then to the buildings of the St. Louis court, to the outer wall, and thence to the hut on the Rue du Aroidesicile? But in that itinerary there existed breaks which seemed to render it an impossibility. Had he placed the plank from his bed like a bridge from the roof of the fine air to the outer wall, and crawled flat, on his belly on the coping of the outer wall the whole distance round the prison as far as the hut? But the outer wall of La Force formed a crenellated and unequal line. It mounted and descended. It dropped at the firemen's barracks, it rose towards the bath house, it was cut in twain by buildings, it was not even of the same height on the Hotel Lamoignon as on the Rue Pavie. Everywhere occurred falls and right angles. And then, the sentinels must have espied the dark form of the fugitive. Hence, the route taken by Thénardier still remains rather inexplicable. In two manners, flight was impossible. Had Thénardier, spurred on by that thirst for liberty which changes precipices into ditches, iron bars into wattles of osier, a legless man into an athlete, a gouty man into a bird, stupidity into instinct, instinct into intelligence, and intelligence into genius, had Thénardier invented a third mode? No one has ever found out. The marvels of escape cannot always be accounted for. The man who makes his escape, we repeat, is inspired. There is something of the star and of the lightning in the mysterious gleam of flight. The effort towards deliverance is no less surprising than the flight towards the sublime, and one says of the escaped thief, how did he contrive to scale that wall? In the same way that one says of Corneille, where did he find the means of dying? At all events, dripping with perspiration, drenched with rain, with his clothes hanging in ribbons, his hands flayed, his elbows bleeding, his knees torn, Thénardier had reached what children, in their figurative language, call the edge of the wall of the ruin. There he had stretched himself out at full length, and there his strength had failed him. A steep escarpment 3 stories high separated him from the pavement of the street. The rope which he had was too short. There he waited, pale, exhausted, desperate with all the despair which he had undergone, still hidden by the night, but telling himself that the day was on the point of dawning. Alarmed at the idea of hearing the neighboring clock of St. Paul strike 4 within a few minutes. An hour when the sentinel was relieved and when the latter would be found asleep under the pierced roof. Staring in horror at a terrible depth, at the light of the street lanterns, the wet, black pavement, that pavement longed for yet frightful, which meant death, and which meant liberty. He asked himself whether his 3 accomplices in flight had succeeded, if they had heard him, and if they would come to his assistance. He listened. With the exception of the patrol, no one had passed through the street since he had been there. Nearly the whole of the descent of the market gardeners from Montreuil,